I can do it for you, don't worry. Take it away, Laura, thank you.
Okie doke. So if I'm going to start this little presentation with this image that was done by Mary Cassatt in 1891, and with a little background. I mean, it's not one of you know, when you think of Mary Cassatt and you think of the main body of her work, you think of mother and children and very soft and sweet and evocative images. But this image was done in 1891, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it as we go on. But the interesting aspect of this is that in 1998, the Art Institute of Chicago and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston organized an exhibition that was a traveling exhibition, and they offered it to a major museum in Paris. And at that time, in 1998, the museum said, Marie qui, Mary who? And they turned down the offer for this exhibition, which is very curious because they consider, or apparently these critics consider Cassatt to be worthy of an exhibition on her own because they viewed French, you know, particularly male French Impressionists as painters. Well, 30-something years later, in 2018, a small museum called the Musée Aquimont André organized an exhibition called Mary Cassatt as an American Impressionist in Paris, which was very well received. But this is a part of a painting, and the painting is called Young Woman Picking an Apple. And I want you to consider that for a moment, because think about the symbolism. And like I said, we're going to come back to that in a few minutes. So to give you a little background, the primary interest in the 19th century, particularly in Europe and France and England, was referred to as the academic painting. And academic painting was a painting that was primarily in the classical style, using classical imagery, classical stories of morality and philosophy in order to get across images that were, and stories that were considered to be righteous and morally, morally correct. They were images that needed to be read primarily by an intellectual kind of a clientele. So the classical imagery more or less appealed not to the hoi polloi or to the middle class. It appealed to the upper middle class. Every year there was in Paris a salon, and in the salon, if you take a look to the picture on the left, in the salon, hundreds and hundreds of paintings were put to a jury for acceptance into the salon. And if you were a painter and had your painting accepted into the salon, you were almost guaranteed that you were going to have a clientele or a patronage by a wealthy aristocrat or a wealthy industrialist or whatever. And in the other painting, you could on the top right, you could see what very often the salons look like. They were meeting places for the genteel classes, and they more or less appealed to the intellectual sensibility. Much of the subject matter in a academic painting revolved around, like I mentioned, classical issues of philosophy, issues of history that could be portrayed through a classical, classical visual imagery. Also classical in the neoclassical, the salon tradition, imagery have a very polished look. The images, the figures in the painting, they had to be very realistic and very three-dimensional. They also had to have a strong image or a strong representation of three-dimensional reality as they were going along. But that appealed, and it assured a clientele for the artist in question. Well, in 1874, and the years leading up to 1874, in Paris particularly, there was a group of artists that started to move in different directions. And they termed themselves, they were like a group of friends, they turned themselves as independent artists. And they convinced a very well-respected photographer whose name was Nadar, to rent out their studio, and they posed in 1874 the first exposition of independent artists, sculptors, and graphic printmakers. And they showed in that show, they showed paintings that were not considered to be classical. They were paintings that were in a realistic trend. There were paintings that had very loose brushstroke. There were paintings that had little or any of historical retrospective. There were paintings that were very much away from the norm. And when this exhibit was displayed, it of course was met with great disdain by the critics, who looked at the paintings and were more or less horrified by the paintings exhibited. And in particular, one of the art critics looked at this painting in the lower right here, which was created by Claude Monet. It's called Impression at Sunrise. It was created in 1872. The critic looked at it and he said, impression, it's not an impression at all. It's more or less, they call these impressions, but it's more or less throwing paint on canvas. Well, that term impressionism stuck, and it stuck with the artists, particularly as critics refer to them, but with the artists in general. And that's how we more or less determine, paintings of this particular ilk as well. Although many of the artists did not refer to themselves as impressionists, they refer to themselves as indigent artists, or artists who were still independent. Several of the artists that represented there are artists that Renoir, who did the ballet dancer up in the right, and you could see that that the use of very soft muted colors. He moved in that direction, not any hard outlines and very little use of black. Bertha Morisot was one of maybe two women that exhibited in the initial exposition. And she was, again, a genre painter, painting in the Impressionist style. And then you have Edward Manet. And Manet, who had come to fame a few years earlier by several of his landmark paintings. The paintings he submitted were very much Impressionist painting, but they had a very different feel as to the two paintings above. And that's because they were very much rooted in compositional form. So there were very strong form to the paintings themselves. So you can see it in the vertical bars of the of the fencing in the first painting, and you can see it in the lines as the line moves around the little rowboat in the second painting. So they're very distinctive paintings in the exposition. And that's because of the paintings of the painters that exhibited. They did not want to be classed into one particular keyhole under one particular umbrella. They more or less wanted to have the freedom to move along in their own direction. And so we get to Mary Cassatt and the Cassatt family. Well, Mary Cassatt, the family, and father was Robert and the mother was Catherine, hailed from Western Pennsylvania. It wasn't their place of origin, but they were living in Western Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh. And in the 1840s and in the 1850s, it was the gateway to the West. So most of the transportation, because the railway really hadn't been formally developed by then, was by canals and was by water. And Robert Cassatt, whose family had been in this country since the 1600s, he was a very successful stockbroker, and he was the land developer. He was a land prospector. We bought large parcels of land, which eventually were taken over by, or were sold to factories, and in more or less to encourage the growth of that area and Pittsburgh in itself. The mother, on the other hand, came from a very wealthy family of bankers, and she had a much more genteel background. She was very, very well educated, very well bred, and she had a very strong interest influence on all of her children, in particular Mary. And the parents together were part of this genteel society that had, proposed high morals and within their own moneyed class. So Mary was born in 1844. She was one of 7 children. Two of her siblings died in infancy, and she was on the younger end of her siblings herself. When she was young, the family, and in their gentility, believed that an integral part of education was travel. And so before she hit the ripe old age of 15, her family had spent 4 or 5 years in the major cities in Europe, London, Paris, and Berlin. And in London, Paris, and Berlin, primarily, again, they weren't industrialized by, totally industrialized by the 1850s, but they still had, the medieval history. They had the classical or the neoclassical history. They were centers of culture. They were centers of art and literature and music. And so it was in this route that the family chose to stay in these particular cities. And also, it's believed that this is where Mary had her first art lessons as a child. She was also exposed to fine art in the Paris Exposition of 1855. And in the Exposition, which again is like a big World's Fair, they had the arts building. And in the arts building, you see in the lower left there, hundreds of paintings that were completed, that were created by the classical, the École des Beaux-Arts, and the painters that painted in the neoclassical style. And it was in this instance that Mary, primarily as a young child, pre-adolescence, got exposure to the primary painters of the academic style of the day. And this would have been her earliest exposure there as well. When she came back to the United States, and the parents lived in Philadelphia, at the ripe age of 15, she enrolled in the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art. And in the Pennsylvania Academy itself, if you look at the lower image, there's a new building. Well, new, it was Victorian, but these buildings are in the earlier part of the 19th century. The students, primarily male, were exposed to learning in a classical way, where they drew and painted from busts. They learned composition, 3D composition, very much in the European academic style. If you look over to the right, you could see an early photograph image of a drawing studio where the students would copy or draw plaster cast models of classical Greek and Roman sculpture, and they would use those in their compositions. So again, by the mid 19th century, both in Europe and particularly in America now, much of the academic artistic training was done in the academic style. And so Cassatt would have learned classical themes. She would have learned about highly finished paintings. She would have learned how to create three-dimensional reality, how to create or tell a story, and again, how to create paintings that were not going to, were going to appeal to a finer intellectual generation. So one of the things that her parents, I'm just going to go back for a second, her parents, particularly her father, was not very keen on this idea. They did not want her to go to an art school or go to have art training, because again, she was from a genteel family. They thought that Mary, as a genteel young woman, would be afraid or would become exposed to, quote, a bohemian behavior and feminist ideas. Now, mind you, this is like in 1860 and 1861. And so and also be exposed to a high population of male students. So she continued, however, at the Pennsylvania Academy and during the course of the Civil War. And looking back on it, she reminisced, quote, "There was no teaching at the academy. Us females could not use live models, so we only were able to use casts." And so she also mentioned that it was at this point that she started studying old masters through prints and any paintings that she could see. She started studying old masters in earnest. In 1866, her family moved to Paris. Her mother, her sister, and some family members moved to Paris. And she moved to in Paris by this point in time, in a 10 or 12 year span, had undergone a great transformation under Baron Haussmann, who more or less rebuilt the city of Paris from its medieval squalor and broadened the streets and lined the streets and created a whole new sense of architecture that's called mansard architecture, if you look at the roofs over there as well. And so Cassatt, who was now in Paris and very anxious to do some studying, the only choice open to her, well, not really open to her, was the École des Beaux-Arts. And the École des Beaux-Arts was the academy school. The École des Beaux-Arts was not open to women, as you can see in the image down below. So as a result of that, she was able to study with masters, art masters, who taught in the école, so to have private tuition. And it was there she got her first major academic tradition in France. At the same point in time, in the 1850s, 1860s, there were several artists that started to challenge the neoclassic or the academic tradition. Two of these artists, one is Corot on the top. Corot was primarily a landscape painter. He one of the initiators of the Barbizon school. He took to painting outside. Painting outside is very different than in the open air. Is very different than painting in a studio, because you're painting the light and the atmosphere, and you're painting you're smelling and you're painting and you're looking all at the same time. And so, he broke away from total studio painting. The artist below is Courbet. Courbet was a realist painter. He more or less was a figurative painter. In his image here, it's the artist's studio. You see on two sides, you see on the right-hand side, you see more of the artists who were still, were very in touch with the academic style, so very learned, of an upper class, as opposed to the artists and the population on the left-hand side, who were more of the, quote, the artist musician type, and they were a little bit more ragged. And he puts himself in the middle, and he's painting a landscape, which again, he's breaking away from the tradition. And behind him is a female model, which would have been very indicative of the artist model in the studio, painting beginning to paint a classical type of imagery. So it's this break that was beginning to happen in the 1850s and 1860s. Well, one of the major mentors that she had was Jean-Léon Jerome. And Jerome was an academic painter. He was a salon painter. He was part of the School de Beaux-Arts, and he taught her the finer aspects of figurative imagery, the creating a narrative, the fine aspects of light and shadow, storytelling. But he was in himself, he was a very highly polished, highly finished painter. So even though he's very well regarded, his figures, and you could see in the figures in both paintings, the figures in the nude, they were very finely created. This was her mentor. So again, in order to supplement her education, she began to, and she was access to a permit to paint and draw in the Louvre. Well, the Louvre gave out a certain amount of passes for artists to come and create in the galleries themselves during the course of a year. And primarily the women who went to the Louvre, they were copyists, and they were American female arts, not American, but they were female art students who would go to the Louvre to copy, to learn, but also they would land up selling some of these images so they could make, make some salary. This was an acceptable place for women to go, particularly an American artist student like Mary Cassatt, because basically regarded in a very day. She went to a cafe where the avant-garde artists used to meet, and she would very quickly gain a very bad reputation. So, but again, this was going to the Louvre was an accepted choice, and it was also an opportunity for artists to talk, and and her herself was artists to meet and talk with fellow artists in a safe environment. One of her other tutors was an artist called Thomas Couture, and Thomas Couture was in the school of Corot. He was a Barbizon school painter. So with Couture, she got a very valuable lesson. He would take his students outside to draw and paint. And this was her first exposure to drawing in the countryside, drawing from life, and particularly not genteel people, farmers and workers in the field, so peasants. So this was for her a very, it's like an open book for her. And the two paintings, or the only two paintings that are documented, as far as I know, that I've read about, are these two paintings from 1868, The Child Drinking Milk and The Mandolin Player. And both of these paintings are done very much, they're finished paintings, but they're done very much in an academic style with very high chiaroscuro, which means high patterns of light and dark, where in these particular paintings, the figures stand out because they're lighter than the background. The background acts as a backdrop to highlight the figures. The Mandolin Player on the right was adopted in 1868, 1869, or was accepted in the Paris Salon, which was a very exciting news for her, because it was the first painting that she exhibited. As the years went on, and as many artists, they would submit to the salon and not be accepted by the jury. But this was fairly well received, even though it was the Mandolin Player was a very pure painting, a simple painting there. So in the 1870, the Franco-Prussian War began, and the family decided it was not a safe place to stay in Paris. So the family moved back to Pennsylvania, Altoona, Pennsylvania, and which again is near in Pittsburgh. And her father again was not very happy with the fact that Mary wanted to consider a course in art, or consider to become a popular painter, a fine arts painter. She, during the period that she was there, it was a couple of years, in the period that she was there, she was almost like in no man's land out in the Western Pennsylvania there. She didn't have any connection to the fine arts world, say of Philadelphia. She did a couple of things. She traveled to Chicago with her paintings, because again, Chicago was on the western edge of the eastern seaboard there, and it was where the West began. And she traveled to Chicago with the paintings in hopes that she might perhaps get some sold. However, something very horrible happened, is that in the Great Chicago Fire in 1871, the paintings that she had brought with her all got destroyed. And so that's why there's no reference to any of her paintings, really, her earlier paintings there. However, when she was in Chicago, the Archbishop of Chicago had commissioned her to copy two images of Correggio, a Renaissance master in the church in Parma. And so that was a commission. So she was so excited, quote, quote, so excited to get back to work again, my fingers itch. So up until that point, until she had these commissions, she gave up her studio. She tore up her father's portrait. She hadn't touched brushes for 6 or 7 months. And then she said, I will never paint again until I see some prospect of getting back to Europe. I'm very anxious to go. If I don't get to Europe, I'm very anxious to go out west and get some employment, but I really don't know what I want to do until I get there. But getting the commission from the Archbishop really gave her the impetus to continue. And so she returned after the commission there, she returned to Europe, but instead of going to Paris, she went to Spain, and she worked in Madrid and Seville for a few months, and she painted traditional Spanish subjects in the style of Spanish masters such as Velázquez and Ribero, which she would have seen in churches. Many of these imagery she would have seen in churches and or small gallery. And so by painting these subjects, the Bacchante and two women throwing flowers, she was painting contemporary Spanish women, or almost in the peasant women, but painting them in the style of Velázquez. She also painted the toreador after the bullfight and Spanish dancer wearing a lace mantilla. And she was attracted to the subject matter in particular because of their costumes and the traditional dress. So, also in the art world was very taken with these type of subject matter clientele because of the fact that they were exotic and they were different, say, from a genteel Parisian or English society there. So it was an exotic kind of a situation there. And then again, she got back to Paris, but she was at a very, very low point yet again. And it was a low point, since she had returned to Europe. And so she took up residence in France, and, she was painting. She was trying to submit paintings to the Salon. They were rejected. She became very, very outspoken as a woman, but she became very outspoken with the jury members. She would submit a painting, they would send it back to her, and they'd say, paint it darker, or do this or do that. And she'd submit it back, and a painting would then get accepted into the Salon here itself. But at this point in time, in 1877, her parents decided to join her in Europe. They all lived in the same apartment. Her father still wasn't very, pleased about her entering into the art world. He decided he wasn't going to help her, maintain her art career, but he would pay, for her basic living expenses. So anything that, like her studio and her supplies, she had to be able to make through sales of her own work. But it was at this point in time, and what brought her down is that she wasn't really selling anything. People liked to look, but they weren't purchasing. And she was very worried that she'd have to support herself painting, quote, quote, pot boilers, which were paintings that were a bit of a, non-academic mode, or go back to the Louvre and start doing copy work and selling, paintings, selling copies of paintings that she would have done. So it was, she made a very good decision, and something very important happened to her life. But she decided then really to focus herself on painting quality works that would absolutely get to the Salon itself. Okay. This was the painting that changed her, one of the paintings that changed her life. It's a painting called Ida. Ida was done after her sojourn in Spain. And it's done, as you see, in very broken brushstrokes. It's done in an academic style with regards to the subject matter, a very, a portrait with a dark background, chiaroscuro. And it was submitted to and accepted at the Salon in 1874. And at the Salon in 1874, a friend of Mary Cassatt's had taken a friend of his, and the gentleman's name was Joseph Tournay. Joseph Tournay was a writer, and he took his friend, whose name was Edgar Degas, to the Salon to view the pictures. But since Tournay knew Mary Cassatt, he wanted particularly to show Degas this painting of Ida. And when it's said that when Degas looked at this painting, he said, "It's true, c'est vrai. Here is someone who feels as I do." Well, that was 1874. And the painting became so special to Mary Cassatt, she held on to it in her own studio until 1913. So the story then goes that Mary Cassatt met Edgar Degas in 1877. However, in 1874, when she moved back to Paris, and she was introduced to the works of Edgar Degas by looking at contemporary drawings or pastels that he would have displayed in one of the galleries on the Boulevard Boulevard de Haussmann. And she remembers, again, that she first started following him or seeing the new work that he would put out in 1875. And she, in a letter to her friend Louisine Havenmeyer, she said, "How well I remember seeing Degas' pastels for the first time in the window of a picture dealer on the Boulevard Haussmann. I would go there and flatten my nose against the window so I could absorb all of his art. It changed my life. I saw art then as I wanted to see it." And so for her, he was an exciting example of art in a modern way that didn't have any classical, classical fixings to it, but it had the energy, and it had, in particular in this instance, in the 1870s, when Degas was really starting to produce his ballet series, it had all of the compositional elements that she was very interested in. In 1877, she was introduced to Degas himself through a mutual friend, and I put this painting up there because it's a painting. The subject matter is Edmund Durante, and Edmund Durante, after the second Impressionist exhibit in 1876, wrote a small book that was basically a catalog to the independent artists, and it was entitled New Painting, or the painting that was coming out that was non-academic. And the pamphlet goes on to say that the painters should revitalize figurative painting, get away from the classical body, move towards characterizations of modern people, a modern person in his clothes, in the midst of his social surroundings, at home or on the street. And so here you see Durante, who was a writer with all of his writing materials, his model, or one of the models that Degas had been using, in an apartment in front of a Degas painting that he had created. He did a whole series of At the Races paintings. So he faithfully recreated this painting to be part. It's a painting within a painting there. So Degas, at this point in time in 1877, when they met, they took on a tremendous friendship because they both came from a similar background, a very genteel background. They both came from a cultured background. They both came with artistic ideals that were very much along the same lines, with composition and form being the highlights of their imagery. And he began to be almost a mentor to her itself. As it turned out, their studios were within a 5 to 10 minute distance of each other. So Degas, on his daily walk, would more or less kind of pop into her studio on a fairly regular basis. Degas also introduced Cassatt to a trend that was being appreciated by contemporary painters, not classical painters, that was being introduced, say, from the mid-1850s into Paris. And they were woodblock prints. Now, woodblock prints to contemporary artists in the 1850s was something that was so totally different. But the woodblock prints for Degas, and as he introduced them to Cassatt, one of the main important aspects of the print themselves was the compositional integrity. So if you look at the image on the left there, the horizontal, vertical, diagonal line. If you look at the image on the right, there's a strong attention to patterns and textiles and shapes and colors. And at the bottom, there's a asymmetrical, there's a strong appreciation of asymmetrical symmetry there as well. So this was a grand introduction to like a personal mentor. So it was an introduction to another way of seeing. In their friendship, they would often go to the Louvre and look at pictures together. And so the two images, these images are all by Degas and themselves. Mary Cassatt could not go to the Louvre by herself. She had to have a chaperone. Her chaperone was her sister Lydia, who was 7 years older than she was. And you'll see Lydia in several more paintings. So Degas commented at this time that he loved to watch Mary Cassatt look at paintings. And so the drawings are reflective of that, where she would really study a painting in itself. At one of their they think it's a mutual session, a studio session. Degas painted the portrait of Miss Cassatt holding cards on the left. You could see how he set up the composition. She basically forms the whole portrait, and with a central figure that is highly defined, and the background is almost as if he's charcoal drawing or pastel drawing, very loose. And again, these are studio portraits, whereas she, at the same time, did a studio portrait of herself. And what's very interesting about this is you can notice that, she's wearing the same hat, the same buffet, different dresses, but what she's holding in her hand, and what they believe it is a sketchbook, because what they think is that Degas also reintroduced her to the use of the sketchbook, which is something that Cassatt really more or less kind of put aside. So it was from this point on, she traveled everywhere with her sketchbook. And it's also, also an interesting way of saying, that the artist is looking, if you look at her gaze, the artist is looking, or Cassatt is looking for something suitable to draw. So in their connection together, and their very strong friendship, it lasted for 40 years, but the highlight, the strength of the friendship lasted probably 4 years, until maybe 1880. She created this painting here. It's called Little Girl in a Blue Armchair, which is a lovely little study. And apparently, as the story goes, when Cassatt was working on this painting, and apparently it's Degas, one of Degas' nieces. She had created the composition. Degas walked in and she said, basically, well, what do you think? And then what he did is that he fixed the perspective of the painting itself. So the lining up of the chairs on the diagonal, you see the diagonal patterns going there, more or less lined up with one of his ballet paintings in the dance studio. So he had a very strong command and opinion about how Mary Cassatt should be creating compositionally some of her artworks. What's very sweet about this painting is that there's maybe a 4 or 5 year old child kind of flopped on a chair, and not concerned about anything. Her little puppy is sitting on the next chair. There's a play of light from the back wall, and it has a very strong cropped image. The cropping of the imagery became a very important, or very important stylized tool in the 1870s, particularly with the invention of the camera and the use of the Japanese prints. Notice the vertical lines in the background, and the use of flattened shapes, shallow space. So the child's figure is more or less forced into the foreground there. So much of the image, much of the inspiration of the structural compositional inspiration came from Japanese prints, as well as Degas, who more or less, manipulated the composition so it would work for him and then for her. In 1877 and 78, again, under the auspices of Degas, you notice several things starting to happen. First of all, Degas not only worked with her very closely in the studio, and they had a great friendship, he also introduced Mary Cassatt to the independent painters, or the painters that had exhibited in 1874, 1876, and 1877. And so in these years, this was such an inspiration for her that even though she was maintaining very strong structural compositions, she also started to lighten up her palette. And in the Lydia Reading the Morning Paper, you'll notice it's a very impressionist palette. It has a lot of pinks and blues and pastels, a lot of soft textural shape. And one of the other things that you should notice, particularly in reading the Figaro, on the left here, you have the strong vertical, but the strong vertical houses a mirror. And it was in this instance that you started to see reflective imagery, which Mary Cassatt used in many of her later paintings there. So the models themselves, on the left-hand painting, Reading the Figaro, it's her mother. On the right-hand painting, Lydia Reading the Morning Paper, it's her older sister, Lydia, which will become Mary Cassatt's prime model for many years. But the important aspect of both of these paintings, in addition to the composition, the color, the handling, and all of that, is the social impact. because as I mentioned earlier, Catherine Cassatt, the mother, was very cultured, was very educated. She believed in, she believed in the rights of women to have an education. And so she also, was the epitome of a new woman. And she was able to propone this to her daughters. And she believed that even in a genteel world that they should have these qualities. And again, this graciousness of her belief that her children, in order to, especially her daughters, in order to exceed in the world, needed to have that as well there. This image here, it's called La Loge, or the Loge, or the let me just get up to my notes here. Okay, this woman, this painting here, 1878. It's considered a very fine painting. It also was in the third or fourth Impressionist or independent artist exhibition. But it's interesting from various aspects, and we're going to look at it in particular for the subject matter. The subject matter, or the object of focus, is the woman in the center. She's at an afternoon performance of the La Comédie Française. She has her opera glasses. She's looking down onto the stage. She stands out from the background because the background is lighter in color. You'll notice in the background that the seats, the row of seats, curls around to meet her and continues around curl. It's a lighter color. It makes her stand out. And while we're looking at her, by the way, she's holding a Japanese fan. But while we're looking at her, the audience and the rest of the seating in the balcony seating there, they're either looking at her as the gentleman is doing, because she now becomes the audience, woman alone in the theater, or they're looking at other members of the audience themselves. So it's observing and being observed, all in the same sentence. And so the audience perhaps is putting on a performance, just as the character actors are as well. So the thought is, why is the gentleman looking at her? Perhaps because she is a woman alone. When this was eventually sent to America in 1878, one of several paintings that were requested by a fellow artist in Boston, in New York, for an exhibit in Boston, and his name was Julian Weir. Julian Weir was an artistic and technical drawing instructor at West Point, and he had two sons that also became artists. So this was one of the paintings that came. But when a critic looked at that, he said, in America, Mary Cassatt surpassed the strength of most men, just from this particular painting. And so the theme of the opera or the ballet or any kind of performance, in particular for Mary Cassatt, was recognized as a perfect theme for a genteel lady to do, and as well as keeping it in the framework of independent artists or artists that were working in an impressionist vein. It was a domestic interior and of a scene of everyday life, and it was, for a woman, a domestic interior was an accepted compositional composition to create, because again, it wasn't in the bars, it wasn't with prostitutes, it wasn't with anything that was of a non-genteel kind of a situation. So you see, she did several. She did both her sister, she did several friends, her cousins, whatever, and they are images that basically were fine to do, and yet portrayed a message. But if you notice in these, even though they're paintings, they have that very, very loose brushstroke that's almost in that's like a charcoal technique. So this loosening up of her brushstroke in the late 1870s was very much with regards to Degas' mentorship. This is was submitted to the Impressionist exhibit in 1879. It's called A Woman with a Pearl Necklace, or it's also referred to Lydia with a pearl necklace in La Loge. And you can see how this is a very very soft, very evocative kind of coloration. There is no dark tones in except the people in some of the balconies there. She's holding a Japanese fan. You also notice something else that can you see that there's her reflection? It's almost as if there is a mirror behind her. So again, this idea of a reflective quality there as well. This was exhibited in the Impressionist Exhibition 1879. Critics looked at it, and one of the things that they had mentioned with regards to this particular painting is that the colors were too bright and the portrait itself was too accurate to be flattering to the subject matter himself. However, the same critic said that he didn't savage, he was in the same time he was giving constructive criticism to this particular painting, he was also savaging Monet's painting within the same show there. But again, this has the idea of gentility and the same structural background, that same strong background that will hold the painting together. If you look on the bottom right, you'll see Manet's at the bar at the Folie Bergère. It's thought that Manet, who experienced this painting, was very taken up with this idea of a reflective image and was influenced to use that same type of reflection in his last painting, the bar at the Folie Bergère. Okay, and here's two other interesting paintings, both of Lydia. One is The Reader and one is A Cup of Tea. Both of them done, again, with the camaraderie of Degas. You notice in both of them, one is a bit more tighter than the other. The Reader itself has a strong vertical background in order to enhance a very looser stroked Lydia's gown. But if you notice in Lydia herself, her face and her hands are very finely completed, so that they stand out much more than the softened garments and the textured background. In A Cup of Tea, again, both activities for refined women, but in A Cup of Tea, it's a much looser brushstroke. You follow, in both images, you follow the lines around. The dark patterned chair serves as the backdrop to push forward the pink dresses. At this point in time, she was, even though she had very strong form in her paintings, if you notice, particularly in the painting, both of them, that one of the Impressionist ideals was to take paint and not just isolate it to one particular area. So if you notice on the painting on the right, in A Cup of Tea, you'll notice within her gloves and the pink gown and the pink hat, there's the same blue tones that are in the blue chair, and vice versa. You'll see that there's pink reflections in the chair, as well as some of the white reflections. And as if you follow around, you'll see many of the color choices that are being used as a compositional trend to more or less have your eye travel around the painting. Then the same goes with the painting on the left. You'll see that even though there's, it's much more, the paints, particularly in Lydia and the chair and the curtain behind her, they're more or less in the same color category, but you'll see that the colors are being used together in the same usage over there. So that very much is from her association with the Impressionists. Also at this point in time, Lydia almost became a daily model for her. In the back of their Paris flat, in the gardens. Again, the gardens were safe places for women to be and to congregate, to meet with friends. With a chaperone. This gave Cassatt an opportunity to paint outside in the open air. Using the many of the same techniques or brush strokes that the Impressionists reused. So, and also stronger colors. But you notice Lydia was her primary model, and it was at this point in time in 1879 that she really started to look at the subject matter of mother and child. And in this particular case, mother combing the child's hair, you'll notice a couple of things. What do you see? You see the mirror, the reflection of the image in the mirror. You see strong verticals and diagonal lines. You see a background that's fairly solid, like the chairs and the wall behind her, that will then enunciate the rough pastel technique of the garments that the mother and the child are wearing. And you'll also see in the face of both of mother and child, very refined, handling of the pastel. This also went into the Impressionist exhibit in 1879. Again, this is the beginnings of mother and children. But she just started to look at this because her nieces and her, she had a lot of young nieces and nephews that were coming into the world. And so she had subject matter that was right there for her to use. So it became very popular. But in particular, if you take a look, Mother About to Wash Her Sleepy Child, again, you see the same influence by the Japanese print as far as the linear perspective or the linear aspect of the chair pattern that highlights the mom and the child. You'll see the shallow perspective where it's more or less forced into the front of the composition. You'll see the play of textures. And then you'll also see the influence of the Impressionists with the colors moving around the canvases there. Okay, so the winter in 1879, 1880 was the best winter, according to Mary Cassatt, because it was at that point in time where her and Edgar Degas were working in tune with each other. They were working to create a portfolio of prints. Degas in his studio had a printing press. He had all the materials. She would go over to his studio. They would work on prints together. He would teach her the fine aspects of aquatint and dry point. And they were coming to the point where they were going to create this portfolio where all of a sudden Degas said, okay, I'm done. And more or less he had a bit of a scruffy personality, even though he had so many wonderful traits. And he more or less, kind of broke the friendship that the two had gathered in the preceding 4 years. It was much later that the interesting thing about this is that it was much later where Degas had mentioned to someone that yes, he could have married her, but no, he would never have been able to make love to her, and they were just more or less companions or artistic companions. But this at this point in time, more or less threw Mary Cassatt into a bit of a tizzy, and again, it was a low point in her life. So she basically now was on her own in her own auspices. And again, she had her own her own studio and her own clientele. And she continued her association with the Impressionist painters and the independent painters and continued showing with them until 1876. So let's take a look at some of the paintings that she did post their breakup or towards the end of their breakup. This painting is called The Tea. It's a very, it's not so, it's included as an impressionist independent, but it's very, very much in tune with her artistic aesthetic, and that is very strong form in a strong compositional form, and that would hold the whole painting together. It's called The Tea. It's a reflection of a genteel parlor scene where a guest comes in and sits down and has a cup of tea. You see the woman on the left with her hand underneath her underneath her chin. She's wearing a brown day dress, which is, spending the day at home. Her guest has come in and complete with the hat and the scarf and the gloves. And if you notice, take a really good look at the way she's holding her teacup, okay? And the pinkies are out. So that's a symbol of a very genteel kind of a scenario with the silver tea set and all of that. It was the thing to do. If you notice on the mantelpiece, you'll notice that there's a ginger vase, which again gives credence to this, what they call Japonismo, that had been taking over the aesthetic sensibilities in France and in England because of all the import of Asian pottery and textiles and all of that. So you see that reflected too in there as well. And so it's this painting as a it's a contemporary drawing of a contemporary drawing room scene. It gives that credence to Cassatt's devotion to surface arrangement, how she sets up the composition, her use of color, and you could see in the painting itself how she uses the impressionist technique of moving the color from object to object, so your eye travels around the painting. And it was also following advanced artistic techniques of the day, which was more in line with the independent painters and less in line with the classical painters themselves as well. So in 1881, this is Lydia, and using one of the nieces as a model. And Lydia is just a woman and child driving in the driving seat, and it's very important in a few ways. And with regards to subject matter, okay, so the woman is driving, she's taking control of the trap, the horse and buggy. You notice the driver is sitting behind her. There's the child, and they're going out on an outing in the Bois de Boulogne. Again, being in a park was a very okay thing for a genteel woman to do. Respectable women could move freely around in society, and it was a meeting place that and scenic destinations for rides within the city itself. But you notice that there's a lot of cropping going on in this particular painting, because you don't see the whole horse and you don't see the rest of the tires or the wagon wheels down at the end. And that cropping comes from two sources. It comes from, again, the Japanese print, the asymmetrical composition, and it also comes from the influence of a burgeoning new industry in photography, this idea of cropping down a vision. So another way to look at this, besides the idea of compositionally, is that a woman is driving, and the child is with her, but the child is also learning from the adult, and it's okay to see a woman in a role of doing a task like this as well. But you also notice that there's a gentleman in this painting, which she didn't do very often, very, very little. These next, in the 1880s, she spent a lot of time doing portraiture in particular of her family and of her very good friends. This is Lady at the Tea Table. The lady just so happens to be her mother, and it's a very formal formal attention to the subject matter. If you notice that she too uses again that reference to the composition of the Japanese prints, that behind her there's picture frame within a picture frame, which tends to bring the figure forward or highlight the figure. There's a textural there's a lot of textural contrasts going on between the solid draping of the woman's gown, very dark, and contrasted with the loosey texture of the mantilla, or the headscarf that she has, which is also contrasted with the shiny porcelain pottery that's on the table. So you have that, and even though it's a portrait, you have this interesting way of displaying that as well. She also did, again, several images of her sister Lydia, and this is in 1880, 1881. What was unknown, and particularly to the world, I guess, around her, and even as you go to look at Mary Cassatt, is that Lydia was very sickly. Lydia was 7 years older than her sister. Lydia never married. Lydia traveled with Mary all over. They were very, very strong companions. Lydia was Mary's best friend and vice versa. They were very, very attached to each other. And so Lydia made the perfect model for her in various compositional experiments and compositions themselves. However, by 1880, 1881, Lydia was suffering from a renal disease, kidney failure, and she eventually died in 1882, which was very sad because Mary lost her best friend. And it's believed, but we'll look at them, it's believed that Mary was very entrenched in her grief, but she also changed her painting style yet again, and you'll see that. She also did a portrait of her brother, Alexander Cassatt, with his son, and you see that she used his son as a child in
quite a lot of compositions, as she used her nephews and nieces as well. But he was a very likable kind of child with the red hair that Lydia had. Her brother, Alexander Cassatt, was the head of the Pennsylvania Railroad. And so, you know, he's for a short period, well, about 6 or 7 years until he passed away in the 1880s. So, you know, she had these ready-made subject matters, but you can see also that even though they're intimate portraits of her brother and his son, you could see how she set up the structure, very similar to the Tea Party subjects. And again, a play on textural design, and also the really strong focusing on the facial features, the character of the subject matter. In the middle 1880s, and I can't see it on my screen. I hope you can see it on yours. You see the two images on the right. Hopefully you could see the full images of them. Those two images on the right were done by Edgar Degas, and we refer to them as keyhole views, where in fact Degas would create pictures of models at their toilet or, you know, in their bath, bathing themselves, combing their hair, doing other things, but they were unobserved, so they weren't facing the camera. Well, images or some imagery that Cassatt had more or less learned, lessons that Cassatt had learned from Degas, was creating a series or several paintings in the same way, pretty much as a girl arranging her hair, fixing up her hair, where the kid, you know, the child is more or less combing her hair, fixing her hair, unobserved, in front of her bureau with the, you know, the picture and the mirror and all that other stuff on the back wall, again serving as a compositional background in order for her to stand up. And then a lovely pastel drawing on the left of the same young woman, again doing the wash. So, you know, the lessons were still there even though they weren't in daily contact. Mrs. Cassatt, Mary's mother, reading to her many grandchildren. And again, this also is showing us, this is post Lydia's death, is showing us this familial, this family bond that Mary had with her mother, and that the mother and Mary had with all the children in the family. So the mother and child theme, and it goes through, you know, several changes. This first in the 1879, 1880, 1881, there was a series of paintings that were done of mothers and their children. And, you know, there was this closeness of togetherness that, you know, that she was working out on in pastel and also in light painting. By 1890, however, they took a little bit of a different tend. And you can see in these paintings, she's still holding on to this very strong compositional basis, whereas the figures take command in a flattened space, but also with the texture of the brush stroke or the pastel stroke, as opposed to the background, which is setting everything apart. In the image on the right, you could still, you know, you could see, you know, the wall, the mirror, or the window that's there, and that heightens up all of the tension or the way of looking at or creating that scene in order for it to stand out. So these were in the early 1890s, and again, she did series of them using, and by this time she was hiring professional models, but also using her family and friends. These are lovely. She really wanted to stay away from sentimentality, but the sentimentality, it's believed, took on a greater meaning once her sister died. And she, you know, she more or less longed for that familiarity with her sister there, and that closeness that she had with her sister, who also never married and never had children of their own. But it was that closeness of the child, or the adult and the child there as well. Okay, so in 1890, 1891, Cassatt took on an adventure. She had gone in Paris, she had gone to see an exhibition of Japanese prints, woodblock prints. And again, you know, they were very popular in this time, and had been made more popular with the use of the independent artists using the compositional techniques. But there was a great exhibition, and she started to decide, you know, decided to start to move in another different direction. The 1890s for her was one of her most busiest periods, most creative time. She was entering into her 50s. She was mature. And she had a very mature way of looking at her art. In her opinions, she's kind of softened her tone. She was less opinionated than she had been, or, 15 or 20 years before. Cassatt became a role model for some of the younger female artists that were living in Paris. And she still stayed in contact with many of her independent artist friends, although the group disbanded after 1886. So after this exhibit, she decided to do a foray into a series of prints based, they were dry point prints, but based on, as you can see in this one was based on a painting of her mother, and that she transferred it into a dry point print here, but based on women and the women's activities. So here are several that she did. You can see in the top left, the mother and child theme is the mother picking daisies in the field. And you notice with the prints that the color is flat and the color is defined by shape. And that's very much symptomatic of creating a print. If you look at the bottom one, afternoon tea, you have the painting that's very, compartmentalized, and it's worked in a very specific pattern with textures and patterns. And yet you have afternoon tea as a print, a similar kind of subject matter, but you have this instead of working with texture, you're working with more or less texture within the print. But she's also in these prints use pastel colors, very light colors, which was very unusual for the times of the day. Here you have at the toilet, doing their ablutions in front of a mirror, fixing your hair. And again, reflecting back on the Degas keyhole images of looking at the model, preparing themselves for the day, but the model is unobserved, or they don't know, they do know, but they're not posing for by looking at directly at the viewer. You notice she loved the use of stripes, and that stripes, the use of stripes really was a strong, bold, structural comment in order to create textural patterns there as well. Perhaps of that whole series, perhaps the most well-known one is called The Letter. The Letter is it just kind of complements and holds the whole purpose of the imagery together. Here is a woman who's sitting at her desk. She has just written a letter. She's sealing the envelope. She's wearing a patterned dress. She's in front of patterned wallpaper. She has a little cravat on that has stripes on it. And yet the item that holds everything together is the case, is the desk, the vertical line, the diagonal lines of the desk, the drawing desk itself, and the chair she's sitting at. And it's a showing a modern day woman doing a modern day task, but in a very simplistic way, which is also, it might sound simple, but it was also quite a laborious type of composition in order to structure. But you notice in these prints, there is no shadowing. There is no three-dimensional reality. Everything is flat, delineated, as you can see on the woman's hands and the garment and itself there as well. So she created a series of 10 prints, and the 10 prints then, working in a printing style, led her to create several paintings that more or less she moved into, using the idea of flat pattern shapes and using them in painting. She did this painting, it's called Boating Party in 1893. What's interesting about this is that, again, this is one of the only instances where she puts a male in the painting. The male doesn't face us. It's not her brother, but he's doing all the work of the rowing. It's presumed that this is a couple that share a child. They're out on a Sunday kind of a picnicky type of thing in a boat. But the aspect of this, and where it's almost directly related to the Japanese print, is that it's cropped, that the shapes are flat and patterned, like the boat shape itself with the chartreuse green and the sail. It's held together with the patterns of the blue sea behind her. The other interesting aspect about this is that there is a visual physical separation between the mother and child and the father, or the gentleman in the picture, by the use of space that runs up in a diagonal line. That diagonal line kind of is paralleled by the diagonal line of the sail of the boat there. You can see the use of the dark shape in the foreground in a flattened space. You could also see the use of the lines, the chartreuse lines of the green boat that kind of takes you through the boat and up into the sail. So your eye moves around the composition to hold everything together. Now, this might not have been an original idea, as if you look at Manet's boating party, which he did 20 years before, which was in one of the independent exhibitions. So she might, and again, all artists learn from each other. As Manet picked up from the reflective image of the mirror in his bar painting, she also picked up an imagery of a boating party there. But this one is very definitely influenced by the planes and the shapes of the Japanese print and the use of textures in design. Okay, now a very important thing happened as a result of her creating the series of 10 prints of women's activities. And one of the people that had bought the set of prints was a woman called Bertha Palmer. Bertha Palmer was in charge of creating or making sure that there was artwork to fill or to gather the artwork for the women's building in the Chicago Exposition of 1893. So in 1891, she went to Paris and she elicited Mary Cassatt's assistance. She commissioned Mary Cassatt to create a mural. Mary Cassatt was not her first choice. Her first choice was turned off by the size of the finished piece. Mary Cassatt was game. She was able to work for 2 years at her mansion outside of Paris. And so the mural was created for the Women's Arts Building, and it fitted in the top atrium of the Women's Arts Building themselves. And you can see it's it's 12 feet tall, and together it's 52 or 56 feet long. She was able to work on them as a triptych, and then they were shipped over to Paris there as well. The sad part about this is that, as in all of these things in particular, the building, when it was torn down, all of the artwork, the structural artwork, was destroyed. So there's no actual remnants except for a photograph or two of these pieces. But the theme is the important theme. And the central theme, or the theme that's in the center there, was young women picking the fruits of knowledge and or science. On the left, there's young girls pursuing fame. And if you take a look at their body language, they're kind of moving in a direction, following something in the sky. And on the right is young women pursuing the fine arts and music and literature and dancing. So it was all about women, and about that, the role that women can play as women in society today. And it was the changing role of women there, and the accomplishments of the role of women themselves. So if you take a look at the images on the right, they were sketches, preliminary sketches, working out sketches for the mural itself. And that's the only thing that I think remains in color for the mural itself. And then a resultant painting, which is where I started, which was the woman picking the fruits of the fruit of knowledge. And so you see it in the context of a finished painting. Now, if you take a look at this painting very carefully, and you look at the woman in a white dress, white was the color of suffragettes, and you look at the woman and what she's picking, what is she picking? She's picking a fruit off the tree of knowledge. Who does she then represent or symbolize? Eve in the Garden of Eden, which is behind her. Okay, so this idea of gaining knowledge and it, for a woman was very an avant-garde type of theme in the community itself. She was asked, as she was working on the project, she was asked, well, why aren't there any men? And she said, well, men, I have no doubt, are painted on many walls of the other buildings. And she said also, if I have not been absolutely, or have not chosen absolutely feminine topics or feminine women, then I failed. I failed at what my task was to be. So I'm almost done. So in the 1890s, again, she went back to the theme of women and children. She was very influenced by Renaissance mother and child's, Madonna and child imagery. She used a lot of that type of correlation between the mother and the child and children in order to base some of her paintings. Again, very much with compositional, strong compositional form and, strong light and lovely, beautiful cherubic faces. She did them in pastel, she did them in paint. And one of the pieces, this was a piece that was very well touted. It's called The Child's Bath, where again, using the influence of the Japanese print with the textures and the patterns, but the tenderness between the mother and the child. The mother is holding the child while she's bathing her feet. If you follow from the picture on the floor, which water, the gift of life, if you follow the picture up the stripes, you notice that the stripes envelop the child. If you notice the position of the child's hands, both on the mom's knee and, she's holding onto the mom's knee and the mother's hand, they're right there together in unison. It's a very, very intimate vignette. So she's combined a lot of stylistic tendencies to create a very intimate image with close faces and that circle of touch that was so important to her, particularly after Lydia died. These are, again, a series of pastels done within the same family over a period of time. And again, that intimacy between the family, between the young child and the older sibling, and the whole mother scene. So it's a family unit. If you notice on the right hand painting, you'll know pastel, that there's an image, there's a mirror there as well. That's again bringing the image forward into a form of plane. This as a resultant image of those sketches is called After the Bath. It's a beautiful image because again, it holds that intimacy together of the mother and both children. Because if you take a look at the child on the right, the young girl on the right, what is she doing? If you follow her right hand around, she's holding the baby's arm. And if you follow that all the way around through the child's right hand, you come in a full circle down the mother's right arm and back up to the child in orange's left arm. You find that it envelops the whole mother itself. So that's the intimacy of the family unit. It's the intimacy of the mother. You'll notice that, again, as in many of these mother and child images, that the background is left loose and textured, whereas the facial features, the most important aspect of the intimacy is the facial features. So they're finally completed. This one was done in 1905. She started to, into the new century, she started to slow down a bit. But this image, again, you see it's a very formal image. You see the mother holding the mirror for the child. So it's like a mirror within a mirror. So it's a picture within a picture within a picture in this one. And the child is sitting on the mom's lap. The mother is very elegantly dressed. The child is nude. But you can kind of translate this to the beginning of femininity for a little girl, whereas, teaching the genteel arts of being a feminine woman. In the early 1900s, as I mentioned, she started to slow down. She was, at this point, she had several very influential friends, which you'll see in a second. And she started to become an advisor to American collectors within her familial circle of American industrialists and wealthy population, New York, Philadelphia, and all of that. And so as she was an advisor, she would encourage them to purchase the independent painters, the painters of the Impressionist ilk and modern painters of the late 19th century, modern French painters. But she encouraged them, and she said, she gave them a stipulation: if you purchase these paintings, as you pass them on, they must go to American institutions. So just in that act alone, that is what brought French Impressionism to the collectors in this country, and then inherited into, into our finer collections. And that being said, one of her great young friends was a woman called Louisine Elder. And Mary Cassatt met Louisine in 1874 when Louisine was maybe 16, 17 years old. She was an aspiring young woman, student, traveling in these genteel circles, very, very wealthy family. Mary Cassatt had encouraged her to make a purchase, and her very, very first purchase in 1877 was was the ballet rehearsal scene by Degas, and they formed this tremendous bond. Well, Louisine Elder became the wife of Harry Havenmeyer. Harry Havenmeyer and Louisine were these great collectors, was part of these great collectors, American industrial collectors, that were purchasing French Impressionists on the advisement of Mary Cassatt. And so, she painted several paintings, over the course of the years. Now, Louisa Havenmeyer was, as wealthy as she was also a suffragette, and she was also very much interested in women's rights. And so she, in 1915 or 1914, decided to create a show of women's paintings. And that show was going to be presented in Philadelphia. Well, in Philadelphia, one of Mary Cassatt's sister-in-law, Eugenie, lived, and Eugenie was on the total opposite sphere. And she was anti-suffragette. She was very much a woman that was against, and she incited Philadelphia society to boycott this show. So she did boycott the show, and Mary Cassatt, in her inimitable way, said, "Well, I'll get you." And all the paintings that she was going to leave to Eugenie's family, she donated or sold. So that part of the family didn't inherit any of Cassatt's paintings. She had the last word. And in one of those paintings was the boating party. So to make another long story shorter, she did great series of paintings of her clients, but also of Durand Ruel. Durand Ruel was the great gallerist in Paris and in the 1860s, 1870s, to the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century with his sons. And when Durand Ruel, who had been showing the Impressionist independent paintings, he went broke in 1880. And it was Mary Cassatt who funded him or advanced him the funding to bring paintings, to open up a gallery in New York. So he never forgot that. And so she remained very loyal to his family. When Durand Ruel had wanted to show images from the Impressionists, the independent artists, he wanted to include this painting that's on the lower right, which is a painting that Degas had done of Mademoiselle Cassatt. And Mademoiselle Cassatt, still Mademoiselle Cassatt in 1913, did not want to have any association with this painting because she was angry at Degas by Degas at this point because of some of the derogatory remarks that he had made about her paintings along the way post their break in their friendship. He had also become he was an anti-Semite. He also was he also had very different political views of her at that same time. So at this point in time, when this painting was exhibited in 1913 under the auspices of Mrs. Havenmeyer, it was titled, Woman with Cards rather than Mary Cassatt. And I'm almost done. In 1910, 1911, right in that time frame there, Cassatt's health started to fail. She had gone on a trip to Egypt, a 2 or 3 month trip with one of her brothers and their family. And this is the only photograph that remains of that is of that, where they had taken a boat and kind of floated down the River Nile, where they had seen all of the Egyptian antiquity. They had gone to Cairo. They had gone to Luxor. They had gone to all of these wonderful Aswan, before the dam was built. And they had gone to all of these wonderful places. And her head was just filled with all of these Egyptian relics and sites and all of this. And as a result of that, when she came back, she was exhausted. And she said, I'm crushed by the strength of this art. I fought against it, but it conquered me. It is surely the art of the past. The past has left us. How my feeble hands can ever paint this and paint the effect on me. So she didn't do any paintings that resulted that. As a result, in 1910, 1911, she was diagnosed with diabetes, rheumatism, neuralgia, cataracts. So she slowed down quite a bit. By 1914, she was almost blind from the cataracts, so she stopped painting. But still, she supported women's causes. She supported Mrs. Havenmeyer. She supported the suffragettes. And she maintained her sensibilities with her art and her love of art. This is probably one of the last paintings she did. It's a very generic type of woman sewing. It could have been a Lydia, her memories of Lydia. It could have been something that gave her tremendous pleasure. But she was in a very sorry state. So in closing, the bond between the two sisters was great throughout her life. She always reflected that bond with, and always lived for her sister. Her sister lived for her. She always lived for the intimacy that she shared with her sister. This image is of the two sisters, but it's of two little nieces of hers, but it just is so reminiscent of the bond that she had with her sister Lydia. In the final, and there's very, very, very few pictures of Cassatt herself, but in her final years, she was looked back upon, or as her biographies refer to her, she was very assertive, particularly in her early days in Paris, fighting against the salon. She had a penchant for high teas. She had very much a penchant for fashion. And she was of that genteel class. She was a connoisseur of women's fashion magazines. She was never considered pretty. She had a ruddy complexion. She had brown hair and big hands. And in her 5'6" frame, she was elegant, and particularly in her collared dresses and scarves and gentility there. But she was truly a modern woman in her time, because, in her time, she was an automobile enthusiast. She attended seances. She was a spiritualist, even though she wasn't particularly spiritual. She saw the equality of the sexes and the high value of children. And although she never married, she had a very full family life until her death, where she was surrounded by her nieces and great nieces and nephews and the whole family. And until the end, and she died, I think, in the 1920s, she still maintained this acerbic wit, because in the 1920s, if you recall, Monet was in Jean Vernet, and he was getting his, garden, all that together. And she said she found Monet unintelligent, and she criticized Renoir's female paintings, the lusty paintings there, his lusty art as too animalistic. And she scorned the Cubists, who were now, gaining fame during the teens. She scorned them, and she called them cafe loafers, as these loafers that hung around in the cafes, kind of hanging around, smoking the cigarettes and coming up with new ideas. So that's it. I hope you were able to get a little bit of a picture of Mary Cassatt as a woman, as an artist, as a woman that was ahead of her time, and as an American painter who was living in France for 60 years, painted alongside French painters, and yet helped to create a whole schemata of her own. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, maybe I can answer one or two for you.